I was unpacking the last of my boxes in the guest room when I overheard the voices drifting in from the kitchen. At first, I thought my daughter-in-law was simply sharing a quiet conversation with my son, maybe about dinner or the errands she'd planned for the week. But as I paused, teacup in hand, their words carried to me with the icy clarity of a winter's wind. "She's a burden," Melissa hissed, her voice low and venomous. "She's been nothing but a drain on our lives since she moved in. I'm not running a retirement home." My heart clenched as my son's voice, softer but no less hurtful, replied, "We'll talk to her, Melissa. Maybe she'll get the hint. We can't keep supporting her forever. We have our own family to think about." I didn't drop my teacup. I didn't gasp or let the tears fall. Instead, I placed the delicate china on the dresser with the same care I'd used when raising that ungrateful man. They thought I was a burden, a useless old woman living off their charity. But what they didn't know, what no one in that house had bothered to ask, was that the burden they were plotting to cast aside was Helen Parker, the silent owner of the trust that funded their mortgage, their cars, even that fancy kitchen she liked to brag about to her friends. I picked up my teacup and smoothed my blouse, a small smile playing at my lips. They had no idea who they were dealing with. Before we dive in, tell me where you're reading from. And if this story speaks to you, be sure to subscribe, because tomorrow I've got something extra special for you. Now, let me take you back to the beginning of how I, once the silent benefactor, became the woman who left and took everything with me. I arrived at my son's home on a drizzly Thursday afternoon, clutching the battered leather suitcase I'd had since my college days. The house, a sprawling two-story colonial with a white picket fence and carefully manicured lawn, looked just as I remembered from my last visit, though the warmth I'd once felt at its threshold seemed to have evaporated. Melissa met me at the door with a tight, polite smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Helen," she said, stepping aside just enough to let me pass. "We've made up the guest room for you." The guest room. I tried not to let the words sting. When George was alive, I'd always stayed in the small bedroom near his office, filled with the scent of his cologne and the warmth of our shared life. But that room was now an office for my son, Alan, complete with a cherrywood desk and 2 computer monitors. Melissa had made sure of that. She led me down the hallway, her heels clicking on the polished oak floor, past family portraits where my face was conspicuously absent. I wondered if she'd chosen those frames, matching, expensive, all the same size, because they looked tidy and coordinated on the wall. Or maybe she'd simply wanted to erase any sign that her husband had once had a life before she came along. The guest room was small, but pleasant enough. A twin bed with a stiff floral quilt, a white dresser, a single nightstand with a lamp whose shade tilted slightly. No photographs, no hint of family, except for a small crocheted doily I'd made for Melissa when they married, tucked under the lamp, half hidden. "It's not much," she said, gesturing vaguely, "but it's comfortable." "It's lovely," I lied, forcing a smile. I'd learned over the years that there was no point in asking for more than Melissa was willing to give. "Dinner's at 6, she continued, checking her watch. "Alan will be home by then. We'll have a chance to catch up." She didn't ask how my drive had been, whether I'd eaten lunch, or if I needed help with my suitcase. Instead, she pivoted on her heel and left me standing in the doorway, her perfume, a sharp, expensive floral, lingering in the air like a rebuke. I set my suitcase on the bed and opened it slowly. Inside were a few neatly folded dresses, a framed photograph of George and me on our wedding day, and a small jewelry box with a tiny brass key. Everything else, my life savings, my carefully managed investments, the trust George and I had established before he passed, remained in my name alone. Not even Alan knew about that. A knock at the door startled me. I turned to see Alan standing there, hands shoved into his pockets, a boyish grin on his face that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Hey, Mom," he said, his voice warm but cautious. "Melissa told me you got here okay." "I did," I replied, softening despite the tightness in my chest. My son, my only child. He looked so much like George when he smiled like that. "It's good to see you, Alan." He stepped forward and pulled me into a quick hug, the kind that was over before it began. "It's good to see you too," he said, but his eyes flicked down the hallway, as if to make sure Melissa wasn't watching. "Dinner at 6?" I asked, echoing Melissa's words. "Yeah, she's making that roasted chicken you like," he said, though the hesitation in his voice told me it was probably her idea of a polite gesture, not his. "Sounds nice," I said, though the smell of home-cooked meals in this house had long since faded. He glanced back toward the kitchen, then back at me. "Listen, Mom," he began, shifting uncomfortably. "I know this isn't easy for you. Staying here, I mean. But we'll make it work. Just try not to rock the boat, okay?" I swallowed the bitter taste of disappointment. My own son, asking me to walk on eggshells in my old age, in the home that I'd helped them buy with money they didn't even know I'd provided. "I'll do my best," I said, my voice steady but soft. "I just want to feel welcome here." He nodded quickly, relief flashing across his face. "Good, good. Melissa's been, well, she's been a little stressed with the kids and everything, but she means well." The lie hung in the air like a heavy fog. I'd seen the way Melissa looked at me when she thought I wasn't watching, like a burden, an obligation. After he left, I sat on the edge of the bed, the photograph of George in my hands. His smile in the picture was warm and open, a stark contrast to the cold reception I'd just received. "Well, old friend," I whispered, tracing the lines of his face with my finger. "It looks like I'm the unwelcome guest in my own family." The clock on the nightstand ticked steadily, a reminder that time was still moving forward, whether Melissa liked it or not. And in that moment, a quiet determination began to grow inside me, a seedling of resolve that would soon blossom into something Melissa and Alan could never have anticipated. Dinner was at 6, but I wouldn't be the same woman who'd arrived on their doorstep that afternoon. Because sometimes the unwelcome guest is the one who leaves and takes everything with her. Dinner was a formal affair in the Hamilton household, a tradition that Melissa had insisted upon ever since Alan's promotion. The table was set with polished silverware and bone-white china, the kind that screamed respectable family, more than warmth or love. I took my place at the far end of the table, next to the small antique cabinet that held Melissa's prized collection of wedding china, gifts from people she barely knew, displayed like trophies to her carefully constructed life. The chicken she'd prepared glistened under the soft glow of the chandelier, a meal that should have smelled like home, but instead reminded me of the countless charity dinners George and I had attended in our earlier days, where polite conversation masked sharp undercurrents. Melissa dished out the chicken in generous portions, but when she set my plate in front of me, she gave me a look that said everything her polite smile didn't. "Bon appétit," she said, her tone perfectly pitched, civil, but with an edge of cold distance that made the room feel 10 degrees colder. Alan, seated at the head of the table, cleared his throat. "So, Mom, how was the drive? Traffic bad?" I cut into my chicken carefully, trying not to let my hands shake. "No, it was fine. A bit of construction, but nothing too terrible." "That's good," he said quickly, his eyes darting to Melissa, who didn't bother to look up from her plate. The children, 8-year-old Ethan and 6-year-old Lila, were seated across from me. They eyed me with a mixture of curiosity and caution, as if they'd been warned I was a fragile antique to be handled with care. "Grandma," Ethan began, his voice tentative, "do you still have that music box you used to play for me when I visited?" My heart warmed at the memory. That music box had belonged to my mother, a small porcelain ballerina that spun to the tune of Swan Lake. I do, I said softly. I brought it with me. Would you like me to play it for you after dinner? His face lit up, but before he could answer, Melissa's voice cut through the moment. I think it's better if Ethan focuses on his homework after dinner, Helen. He's behind in math, and we don't want him distracted. Ethan's face fell, and I felt a sharp pang in my chest, a reminder that even the smallest joys could be rationed out like sugar during a war. Of course, I said evenly, though my hands clenched under the table. Another time, then. Melissa nodded briskly, as if she'd won a small but significant battle. Exactly, she said, turning her attention to Alan. Did you talk to Mr. Spencer today about the Johnson contract? Alan glanced at me, his smile apologetic. Yeah, we did. Looks like we're moving ahead with the proposal. I'd helped Alan get his foot in the door at Spencer and Reed. George's connections, the same ones Melissa now dismissed as ancient history, had paved the way for Alan's success. But that was a chapter she preferred to ignore, rewriting the narrative to feature her unwavering support and strategic wisdom. Dinner continued in strained politeness, each of us navigating the meal like diplomats at a summit, careful not to reveal too much, not to cross any invisible lines. Every time I spoke, Melissa's eyes flicked to Alan as if to remind him that this was her table, her home, her rules. When the plates were cleared, Melissa stood and began collecting the dishes, stacking them with practiced efficiency. I started to rise to help, but she waved me off with a tight smile. Don't worry about it, Helen. You're our guest. Her words dripped with the unspoken addition. For now. Alan lingered at the table, his hands fidgeting with his napkin. Mom, about the guest room. I know it's not the same as before, but we thought it would give you some privacy. I held his gaze, the flicker of the boy he'd once been buried deep in the lines around his eyes. I appreciate it, I lied. It's comfortable. He nodded, relief evident, but his eyes couldn't quite meet mine. Melissa returned, drying her hands on a dish towel. Well, she said briskly, it's been a long day for everyone. We should all get some rest. Alan hesitated. Mom, if you need anything. I'll be fine, I said, rising from my chair. Good night, Alan. Good night, Melissa. Melissa didn't bother to respond, her attention already on the children as she ushered them upstairs, her voice low but firm, commands disguised as bedtime instructions. I returned to the guest room and closed the door behind me, the click of the latch sounding like a final verdict. I sat on the edge of the bed, the photograph of George in my hands once more. Well, old friend, I whispered, tracing his face with trembling fingers. It seems I'm not just the unwelcome guest. I'm the inconvenience that can't be gotten rid of fast enough. The house was silent now, save for the muffled voices drifting down the hallway, a mother instructing her children, a husband agreeing with his wife. And in that silence, I made a silent vow. They would learn that the guest they had so carelessly dismissed was not the burden they imagined. She was the storm they had never seen coming. The next evening, dinner at the Hamilton household, Melissa's domain, was prepared with the same meticulous precision as the night before. Roasted vegetables in perfect symmetry, a salad with each leaf arranged like it had been painted for a magazine spread, and bread that smelled of rosemary and crisped edges. It was a meal that whispered of domestic perfection, but the air around the table felt heavy, like the hush that precedes a thunderstorm. Melissa poured herself a glass of white wine, swirling it slowly, as if contemplating the secrets it might hold. Alan sat beside her, his posture stiff, eyes fixed on his plate. The children were absent. Melissa had decided that this meal was for the adults, an opportunity to catch up, as she put it. though it felt more like an ambush than a family dinner. I took my seat at the same spot, my heart steady despite the tension that clung to the air like damp linen. I'd felt this before, at boardroom tables and trust meetings, at the hospital when George was dying, moments where the world balanced on the edge of a single word. Melissa cleared her throat, breaking the fragile silence. "Helen," she began, her voice carefully measured. "Alan and I have been talking." I set my fork down gently. "Oh?" Alan shifted uncomfortably, avoiding my gaze. "Mom," he said, voice low. "We've been thinking well, about the future, about what's best for everyone." I felt the muscles in my jaw tighten. "Best for everyone," I echoed softly. Melissa jumped in, eager to fill the silence with her own script. "We just think that, at your age, maybe it's time to consider a more appropriate living arrangement." "Appropriate," I repeated, my tone calm, but with a dangerous edge. Melissa's eyes gleamed with false sympathy. "A place where you'd have the support you need. Somewhere with staff who can help you with day-to-day things. You've been through so much, Helen. Losing George, managing on your own for so long. We just want what's best for you." She paused, letting the words sink in like barbs. I recognized the tactic. Emotional warfare dressed up in concern. Alan still couldn't meet my gaze. "Mom, it's not that we don't want you here," he mumbled. "It's just, with the kids, and Melissa's job, and my schedule." I leaned back in my chair, crossing my arms over my chest. "And the house I helped you buy," I added, my voice smooth as silk. "With the trust I managed, with the money George and I built together." Alan flinched, and Melissa's smile faltered just a fraction. "It's not about money," she insisted, her tone brittle. "It's about what's best for you, and for us." I took a deep breath, the memory of the trust account I'd quietly established for Alan, the one they didn't even know existed, flashing through my mind. The irony was almost too rich. "Melissa," I said, my voice calm but deadly, "do you know what's best for me? Sitting at a table where I'm treated like a burden, where every word I say is met with polite disdain, where I'm assigned a guest room in a house I helped you buy with funds you think came from nowhere. Do you think that's best for me?" She blinked, momentarily speechless. Alan reached for my hand, but I pulled away. "Mom, please," he pleaded. "We're just trying to protect yourselves," I finished for him. "To make sure I don't disrupt your perfect little world." Melissa's voice regained its edge. "Helen, we're only trying to be responsible, to plan for the future, to avoid complications." I tilted my head, studying her like a specimen. "Complications," I repeated. "Such as?" She hesitated, glancing at Alan, who gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. "We've spoken to a lawyer," she said finally. "About the house, about the inheritance. We need to be sure everything is fair." The room fell silent, except for the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. I felt a cold calm wash over me. The same calm I'd felt when I negotiated George's shipping contracts, when I'd sat across from board members determined to underestimate me. "And what exactly did you discuss with this lawyer?" I asked, my voice even, controlled. Melissa took a deep breath. "We've drafted an amendment to Alan's inheritance, just to ensure that if something happens to you, there's no confusion about the house or the trust." I arched an eyebrow. "An amendment," I repeated, "without consulting me." Alan's eyes met mine, full of guilt and uncertainty. "Mom, it's just paperwork," he stammered. "It's not a big deal." "Oh, but it is," I said, my tone icy. "It's a very big deal when your own family treats you like a burden. when they plot to secure their future by erasing you from it. Melissa's lips thinned into a cold smile. Helen, she began, her tone patronizing, you have to understand. I rose from my chair, my hands steady. No, Melissa. It's you who will have to understand. The shock on their faces was almost satisfying. I think, I continued, that perhaps it's time you both realized exactly who you're dealing with. And in that moment, I decided that the unwelcome guest would be leaving, but not without taking everything she was owed. I closed the door to the guest room behind me with a quiet click, the final wordless punctuation mark to the dinner table confession that had left the entire house vibrating with a silent tension. The air in the hallway felt heavier now. The polite pretenses of family unity stretched thin like old wallpaper, brittle and ready to peel. I sat on the edge of the twin bed, my hands resting on my lap as the shadows lengthened across the floorboards. My mind buzzed with the implications of Melissa's revelation, that she and Alan had not only considered my removal, but had already involved a lawyer. The betrayal wasn't the paperwork itself. It was the secrecy, the presumption that I would simply roll over and accept their decision as if I were a relic to be tucked away in storage. The photograph of George sat on the nightstand, his warm smile a painful reminder of the days when family meant loyalty and respect, not strategies and inheritance maneuvers. Well, George, I whispered to the glass-encased image, it looks like the foundation you and I built for this family has begun to crack. A sudden movement outside the window caught my eye. A flicker of headlights, the hush of tires on wet pavement. Alan's car pulling away from the house, his silhouette visible behind the wheel, leaving me alone with his wife's icy hospitality. I had a suspicion about where he might be going. The lawyer Melissa had mentioned no doubt had an office downtown, one of those sleek operations that specialized in wealth management and legacy planning, code words for dividing up what they assumed would be left behind. I rose, crossing to the dresser and opening the small jewelry box with the brass key. Inside, nestled among the few pieces of jewelry that held more sentiment than value, was a set of neatly folded documents, copies of the trust George and I had established, the bank statements from my private accounts, the deed to a small coastal cottage I'd kept in my name alone. They were my insurance policy, my silent ace in the hole. I ran my fingers over the documents, a sense of calm purpose washing over me. Melissa thought she had me cornered, that her carefully orchestrated dinner table confession would nudge me out of their lives with polite finality. But Melissa didn't know that the woman she'd dismissed as a burden had spent a lifetime learning how to read between the lines, how to turn polite smiles into leverage, how to wield silence like a sword. A quiet knock at the door pulled me from my thoughts. I tucked the papers back into the box and turned just as the door creaked open. Catherine, sweet, hesitant Catherine, stood there, a frown creasing her forehead. "Grandma?" she said softly, stepping into the room. "Mom said you were resting, but I wanted to check on you." Her voice, though uncertain, was a balm in the cold house. I smiled gently. "Come in, dear." She crossed the room and perched on the edge of the bed beside me. "Dinner was tense," she said carefully, as if afraid to acknowledge what we both knew to be true. I reached for her hand, warm and small in mine. "It was," I agreed. "Your mother and father have been discussing changes." Catherine's eyes darkened. "I heard them talking in the kitchen last week. Mom was upset that you still had money in your own name. She said it was unfair." A humorless laugh escaped my lips. "Unfair," I repeated, letting the word hang in the air. "She thinks it's unfair that I didn't simply hand over everything to them? That I didn't sign my name on the dotted line like a good little old lady?" Catherine's cheeks flushed. I don't agree with her, Grandma. It's your money. You earned it with Grandpa. You should get to decide what happens to it. My heart warmed at her words, but I kept my expression calm. You're a smart girl, Catherine. Never let anyone make you feel small for protecting what's yours. She nodded, a fierce determination in her eyes that reminded me so much of George when he was younger. Mom and Dad don't realize how strong you are, she whispered. They think you're just old. I squeezed her hand. Let them think that. Sometimes the best strategy is to let people underestimate you. A sudden crash echoed from the kitchen, followed by Melissa's sharp voice scolding Ethan for dropping a plate. The tension returned to Catherine's face. I should go, she said quickly, standing. But, Grandma? Yes, dear. Just promise me you won't let them push you around. Promise me you'll fight back. A slow smile spread across my lips. Oh, Catherine, I murmured. You have no idea. She smiled too, a brief but genuine flash of warmth, before slipping out of the room. I stood and crossed to the window, watching the darkness deepen beyond the picket fence. The cracks in the foundation of this family had started long before I'd moved in, but now they were widening with every secret, every lie, every polite betrayal. Tomorrow, I thought, as I placed the jewelry box back in the dresser. Tomorrow, I'd begin planning my next move. Because sometimes the cracks in the foundation weren't signs of weakness. They were opportunities to rebuild on your own terms. And I intended to do just that. The morning after Melissa's dinner table confession dawned gray and damp, the kind of day that felt like the world itself was withholding judgment, waiting to see how the pieces might fall. I rose early, the house still hushed with the gentle breathing of children and the quiet hum of the refrigerator. The smell of coffee drifted from the kitchen, but no one was there. I poured myself a cup, my movements deliberate, my mind already turning over the conversation from the night before. The documents in my jewelry box weighed heavily on my thoughts. There was power in those papers, power that could upend Melissa's carefully constructed plans, and perhaps Alan's too, though I still hoped my son hadn't sunk as deeply into her schemes as I feared. The kitchen felt cold, the walls lined with family photos that told a story I'd become a footnote in. Alan's face smiled out from every frame: school portraits, wedding photos, father and son fishing trips. But none of them included me. My presence had been edited out, as if I'd been nothing but a shadow in his life, a reminder of a past he no longer needed. A quiet creak behind me made me turn. Alan stood in the doorway, hands buried in his pockets, his hair still damp from the shower. He looked older than his 38 years, lines etching his forehead, shadows beneath his eyes. Mom, he said, his voice hesitant. Alan, I replied, my tone carefully neutral. He crossed the kitchen slowly, as though afraid he might startle me. About last night. I set down my coffee cup, folding my hands on the counter. Yes? He glanced away, unable, or unwilling, to meet my gaze. Melissa was she was trying to be practical. You know how she is. I arched an eyebrow. Practical, I repeated. Is that what you call discussing changes to my inheritance without telling me? Drafting amendments to the trust we built to protect this family? His jaw tightened, but he didn't deny it. Instead, he let out a slow sigh. Mom, it's complicated. Melissa worries about herself, I finished. About securing her position, about ensuring her children, and you, get everything, with no risk that I might have a say. Mom, he said again, softer now, almost pleading. That's not fair. She's trying to look out for the family. I leaned back against the counter, studying him. And what about you, Alan? What do you think? His shoulders slumped as though the weight of my question was too heavy to bear. He ran a hand through his hair, his eyes fixed on the floor. "I don't know," he admitted at last. I don't want any more conflict." A bitter laugh escaped my lips. "Conflict," I echoed. "Is that what you call betraying your own mother's trust? Is that what you call treating me like a burden you'd rather not carry?" His head snapped up, his eyes wide. "I never said that." "You didn't have to," I said, my voice like ice. "Your silence said it for you." He swallowed hard, guilt flooding his face. "Mom, I cut him off with a raised hand. "No, Alan, you made your choice. You stood by while your wife plotted to erase me from this family. You stood by while she planned to pack me off to some retirement home like a piece of old furniture. And you said nothing." He took a step closer, his voice trembling. "I didn't know what to do," he said, his eyes pleading. "Melissa, she's strong. She always knows what to say. And you—" He hesitated, his voice faltering. "You're stronger than both of us, Mom. I thought you'd be okay." The ache in my chest was sharper than any knife. "Okay," I whispered. "You thought I'd be okay." He reached for my hand, but I pulled it back. "You're my mother," he said desperately. "I love you." I met his gaze, my heart breaking. "Love," I repeated softly. "Love isn't silent when someone's plotting to cut your mother out of her own home. Love doesn't hide behind a wife's schemes. Love stands up. Love defends." He flinched, tears welling in his eyes. "I'm sorry, Mom. I didn't know how to—" I shook my head, a sad smile curving my lips. "You didn't know how to choose between us, and so you chose silence. But silence is its own choice, Alan, and it's one that carries consequences." He wiped at his eyes, his shoulders shaking. "What can I do now? How do I fix this?" I picked up my coffee cup, the liquid cold and bitter. "That's something you'll have to figure out," I said, my tone gentle but firm. "Because from now on, I'm not waiting to be rescued. I'm taking control of my own future." He stared at me, the silence between us stretching taut. And in that silence, I realized that the boy I'd raised was still in there somewhere, hidden behind the man who'd let his wife do his thinking for him. But whether he could find that boy again was up to him. "Mom," he whispered, his voice trembling, "please don't leave." I set the cup down and met his gaze one last time. "I already have," I said softly. "You just haven't noticed yet." I turned away, leaving him standing there in the kitchen, the cracks in the foundation widening with every silent plea. The invitations had gone out weeks in advance, handwritten by Melissa on cream-colored cardstock with gold embossing. A simple gathering, she called it, though nothing about Melissa's parties was ever simple. It was Ethan's 9th birthday, and she'd orchestrated every detail like a general preparing for battle. Balloons in shades of blue and silver were already drifting lazily around the house, and a local bakery's cake, a 3-tiered confection that could have fed an army, sat under a glass dome on the kitchen island. I stood in the corner of the living room, my hands folded neatly, watching as Melissa flitted from guest to guest, greeting each parent and child with a practiced smile. Her voice was high and bright, the kind that made people think they were welcome even when they weren't. Alan moved among the guests more hesitantly, his eyes seeking me out now and then, as if looking for reassurance. But after our conversation in the kitchen, he'd kept his distance, the silence between us thicker than the frosting on Ethan's cake. I'd almost skipped the party altogether. After Melissa's dinner table confession and Alan's cowardly silence, I'd packed a small overnight bag and hidden it in the bottom drawer of the guest room dresser, just in case. But Ethan had slipped into my room the night before, his eyes wide and hopeful, and whispered, "Grandma, will you be at my party tomorrow?" And so here I was, playing the part of the doting grandmother, while the cracks in the foundation threatened to split the house in two. Ethan's friends darted between the living room and the backyard, high on sugar and freedom. The adults clustered in small groups, their conversations full of polite laughter and the careful exchange of suburban pleasantries. Every now and then, I caught snippets of conversation that made me want to laugh or cry. "Melissa's so organized. This party is perfect. Did you see the new SUV Alan bought? They're really doing well. I heard Helen moved in with them after George passed. Must be hard to adjust." They spoke of me as if I were an afterthought, a piece of outdated furniture to be shifted around as needed. I felt like a ghost, floating through the house that my money had helped build, unacknowledged and unwanted. Melissa's voice rang out from the kitchen, calling for Alan. "Can you help with the cake, honey?" she chirped, her tone all sweetness and light. I watched as Alan hurried to her side, his face a mask of obedience. He'd become a man who jumped when his wife called, no matter how humiliating the leap. I wondered if he'd even noticed the little cracks in his own dignity. Ethan appeared beside me, his cheeks flushed from running outside. "Grandma," he panted, "will you sit with me when we do cake? I want you next to me." My heart ached at his innocence. "Of course, darling," I said, brushing a sweaty lock of hair from his forehead. "I wouldn't miss it for the world." Melissa's smile flickered when Ethan announced he wanted me at his side. "That's sweet," she said tightly, her eyes sharp as glass. "But remember, Ethan, Grandma gets tired. She might want to rest." I met her gaze head on. "I'm not tired," I said, my voice calm but unyielding. "I'm right where I need to be." The guests gathered around the table as Melissa carried in the cake, candles blazing. She'd arranged them in a perfect circle, a little birthday crown. The room filled with laughter and chatter as everyone began to sing. I took my place beside Ethan, resting my hand on his small shoulder as he beamed at the candlelight. But as the song ended and he leaned forward to blow out the candles, I heard it. A voice behind me, soft but unmistakable, speaking to someone just out of view. "She's practically living off them now. Poor Alan. Melissa says she's draining their resources. I'd have put her in a home by now." The words hit me like ice water, my hand trembling slightly on Ethan's shoulder. My eyes darted to Alan, but he hadn't heard. His attention was on the cake, on making sure every child got a slice. Melissa had heard. Her lips curved into a small, satisfied smile as she turned away. The room blurred around me, the laughter and voices mixing into a dull roar. I felt like a vase in a second-hand shop, admired for its history, but never truly valued. Ethan tugged at my sleeve. "Grandma, are you okay?" I swallowed the lump in my throat and nodded. "Of course, sweetheart. I'm just thinking." And in that moment, I knew. This birthday party, this carefully orchestrated charade of family unity, was the turning point. The foundation had cracked too deeply to be repaired. That night, after the last balloon had deflated and the final guest had left, I stood by the window, watching the streetlights flicker on. The house was quiet, except for the distant murmur of Melissa and Alan arguing in the kitchen. I couldn't hear the words, but the tone was unmistakable. Melissa's sharp, Alan's defeated. I turned away from the window and began to pack my small overnight bag. The jewelry box went in first, followed by the documents and a handful of clothes. This time, I wasn't waiting for permission or apologies. Because sometimes, a birthday party is more than cake and candles. Sometimes it's the moment you realize that the only person you can rely on is yourself. And sometimes, that's exactly what you need to finally walk away and take everything with you. The birthday party had ended in a swirl of wrapping paper and the sticky residue of frosting on plates that no one bothered to wash. Melissa's laughter had rung too loud, too forced, like a performer on a stage who had forgotten her lines but carried on anyway. Alan had disappeared into his study after the last guest left, leaving the cleanup to Melissa, who barked orders at the children as if they were soldiers. I retreated to the guest room, closing the door softly behind me, and sank onto the edge of the bed. The overnight bag sat at my feet, the jewelry box and documents packed with meticulous care. My hands rested in my lap, but my mind was a storm. I'd given this family everything, my time, my love, my money, and yet I'd become a problem to be managed, a burden to be offloaded at the earliest opportunity. The birthday party had sealed it for me. That whispered comment about putting her in a home was more than gossip. It was a glimpse into the truth of what they thought of me. A soft knock interrupted my thoughts. The door creaked open, and Alan stepped inside, his tie loosened, his face drawn. He looked older than his years, and for a fleeting moment I pitied him. But pity didn't change the facts. "Mom," he began, his voice hesitant. "Can we talk?" I folded my hands in my lap. "Of course, Alan." He stepped inside, closing the door behind him. "Melissa's worried," he said, staring at the floor. She's worried about the future, about money, about the kids." "About herself, you mean," I corrected, my tone calm but firm. He winced. "It's not like that." I arched an eyebrow. "Isn't it?" He let out a sigh, scrubbing a hand through his hair. "I don't know. Maybe it is. I just want everyone to get along." "Everyone," I repeated, my voice tinged with bitterness. "You want everyone to get along, Alan, but you let your wife talk about putting me in a home while you sat there and said nothing." His face paled. "I never agreed to that," he whispered. "No," I said softly. "But you didn't stop it either." He slumped into the chair by the dresser, his shoulders rounded like a defeated man. "I feel trapped, Mom. Melissa, she's so strong. She makes plans. She thinks she knows what's best." "And you let her," I said, my voice like steel. He didn't deny it. A silence settled between us, thick as fog. I could almost hear the clock ticking in the hallway. I'd been silent for too long, letting them mistake my kindness for weakness. But kindness without boundaries becomes a trap, and I'd finally found the key. "Alan," I said quietly, "do you remember the money your father left you?" His head snapped up, confusion in his eyes. "Of course, the trust fund." I nodded. "Who do you think managed that trust? Who made sure it grew, that it funded your college, your first house, your business?" His eyes widened. "You?" "Yes," I said, my voice steady. "Your father trusted me with everything, every cent, and I honored that trust. I invested wisely. I protected it, and I protected you." He swallowed hard. "I didn't know." "Of course you didn't," I said, my tone softening. "Because I never made it about me. I wanted you to have every opportunity. But now—" I paused, letting the weight of my words sink in. "Now I see that you've let someone else tell you who I am. You've let Melissa define me as a burden, as an obstacle to be managed." Tears welled in his eyes. "Mom, I'm sorry. I didn't mean—" I held up a hand. "No more apologies, Alan. Actions speak louder than words." I rose from the bed, picking up my overnight bag. "I'm leaving tomorrow." His eyes widened in panic. "Mom, please, don't go. We can fix this." I shook my head. "You can't fix what you refuse to acknowledge. I'm leaving, and I'm taking what's mine with me." He stared at me, stricken, his lips trembling. "What do you mean?" I paused at the door, the weight of years pressing on my shoulders but lifting too. I mean, Alan, that this house, this life you and Melissa have built on a foundation of my sacrifices, it's not as solid as you think. And when the cracks widen, I won't be here to hold it all together. I opened the door, stepping into the hallway where the shadows loomed long. "Good night, Alan," I said, my voice steady. "Get some rest. You'll need it." As I walked down the hallway, past the family photos where I was always missing, I felt a strength I hadn't known in years. The final straw had fallen, and with it came the freedom to reclaim what was always mine. Tomorrow, I would leave this house behind, and I would take everything with me. The morning sunlight slanted through the blinds in the guest room, painting the walls with stripes of gold and shadow. I sat at the small writing desk by the window, a steaming cup of coffee in hand, staring at the delicate floral curtains Melissa had picked out. Her attempt, no doubt, to make the room feel homey. But even the pretty print couldn't mask the coldness that had seeped into every corner of this house. I'd slept fitfully, my mind turning over the events of the past few days. The dinner table confession, Alan's silence, the birthday party that had revealed so much with so few words. But it wasn't just their betrayal that had kept me awake. It was the realization that I'd allowed it to happen. I'd given them my trust, my support, my money, always assuming that loyalty and gratitude would be enough to hold this family together. But loyalty without respect was a chain, and I'd worn it long enough. I took a sip of coffee, savoring its bitter warmth, and opened the small wooden jewelry box I'd hidden at the back of the dresser. Inside, nestled among the trinkets of a life carefully curated, was a small stack of papers, bank statements, trust documents, and at the very bottom, a single envelope addressed to myself in my own handwriting. In case of emergencies. I slid the envelope free and unfolded the letter inside, the paper soft from years of handling. George and I had started it decades ago, a habit we'd both shared, to write ourselves letters for the future, reminders of who we were and what we'd built. This one was different, though. This one was a roadmap. "Dear Helen," I had written, my hand steady even back then. "If you're reading this, it means you've reached a point where trust and patience are no longer enough. This is your reminder. You've always had an exit plan." Beneath the letter was a statement from a small regional bank, one Melissa and Alan didn't even know existed. The account had started small, just a few $100s set aside from my teaching salary before George had grown the shipping business into the empire that would carry our family for decades. Over time, I'd added to it. Dividends from investments, proceeds from the sale of some antiques, small gifts I'd received and quietly deposited. It wasn't a fortune compared to the trust funds I'd managed for Alan, but it was mine. Entirely mine. I ran a finger down the balance line. 6 figures. Enough to buy freedom and then some. The knowledge settled over me like armor. Melissa thought she'd cornered me, that she'd maneuvered me into a place where she could manage me like an aging pet, graciously tolerated until I became too much trouble to keep. But what she didn't know, what Alan had never bothered to ask, was that I'd always known better than to put all my trust in other people's hands. I folded the papers and slipped them into my handbag. I'd already packed my essentials, my clothes, my few pieces of jewelry, the photo of George that had watched over me through all these years. But now I felt lighter, as if every step I took out of this house would be carried by the strength of every decision I'd ever made to protect myself. A knock on the door startled me. I turned to see Catherine's small, hesitant face peering in. "Grandma?" she whispered, stepping inside. "Are you okay?" I smiled softly, patting the seat beside me. "Come in, sweetheart." She sat down, her dark hair falling into her eyes. "I heard Mom talking to Dad last night," she confessed, her voice trembling. "She said you were going to leave, that you were going to take everything. I reached out and brushed the hair from her face. I am leaving, Catherine. But I'm not taking anything that isn't mine. She chewed her lip, uncertainty written all over her young face. But where will you go? I gave her hand a gentle squeeze. I have other places, other homes, other plans. Her eyes filled with tears. I don't want you to go. I felt my heart tighten, but I stayed firm. Sometimes, I said gently, leaving is the only way to remind people of what they've lost. She buried her face against my shoulder, and I held her tight, letting her tears soak the thin cotton of my blouse. For a moment, the years fell away, and I was simply a grandmother comforting her granddaughter. But then the front door slammed, and Melissa's voice carried up the stairs like the crack of a whip. Catherine, breakfast, now. Catherine pulled back, her eyes red but determined. I'll write to you, she whispered fiercely. And when I'm older, I'll come visit you. I promise. I kissed her forehead. I know you will. As she left, I stood, gathering my handbag and the small suitcase. My heart was steady, my mind clear. The hidden savings account was more than just money. It was proof that even in the darkest moments, I had always planned for my own survival. As I walked to the doorway, I paused and looked back at the room, my prison and my sanctuary all in one. The cracks in the foundation had grown too wide to ignore, and now it was time to walk through them and take everything that was mine. The morning air was crisp as I slipped out the back door, my small suitcase in hand. Melissa's voice still drifted through the house, sharp, commanding, like a general marshalling her troops for a war she'd already decided she'd won. But this was a battle she hadn't seen coming, and I wasn't about to give her the satisfaction of a final confrontation. The hidden savings account, tucked safely into my handbag, was more than just a number on a piece of paper. It was a testament to the woman I had been before I'd become mom or grandma, before my identity had been folded and pressed to fit the mold that everyone else needed me to be. I paused on the back porch, the cold iron railing steady beneath my hand, and let the weight of that realization settle. When George and I first married, he was an ambitious man with a vision as wide as the horizon. He'd built his shipping business from the ground up, and I'd stood by him every step of the way, managing the household, raising Alan, and quietly learning the art of finance from the man himself. He'd taught me more than he realized. On one rainy evening, after Alan had gone off to college, George had taken me to his study. The fireplace had cast a warm glow, dancing shadows across the mahogany shelves lined with business ledgers and maritime charts. Helen, he'd said, his tone serious, never put all your trust in one place, not in business, not even in family. I'd frowned at the time. George, what are you talking about? He'd looked at me with eyes that had weathered every storm. I've built this company for us, for Alan someday. But things change. People change. I want you to be prepared. That's why I've set up a small account in your name. Something separate. Something that's yours, no matter what. I'd protested at first, saying we were a team, that everything we had was shared. But he'd insisted. It's not about trust, he'd said. It's about protection. For you. For us. Promise me you'll keep it safe. And I had. Decades passed, and that small account had grown. Steadily, quietly, nurtured by investments I'd made on my own. Dividends reinvested. A small rental property sold at a profit. Even after George passed, I'd kept adding to it, honoring the promise I'd made. That account had been my shield and my sword. The knowledge that I wasn't beholden to anyone had given me a quiet strength, a secret weapon I'd wielded with discretion. Even when Alan and Melissa had needed help with the down payment for their house, I'd drawn from the trust George and I had built together, never touching the account that was mine alone. And now, standing on the threshold of my escape, I felt the weight of that secret lift from my shoulders. It was time to step into the light with it. The taxi idled at the curb, the driver eyeing me through the rearview mirror. I slid into the back seat, the leather cold beneath me. "Where to, ma'am?" he asked, his tone polite but disinterested. I gave him the name of the small coastal town 2 hours away, a place George and I had visited on our 10th anniversary. I'd fallen in love with its rocky beaches and the old lighthouse that still sent its beam across the sea each night. As we pulled away from the house, I turned to look back one last time. The white clappered walls and carefully manicured lawn were still and silent, the house asleep in the early morning light. I wondered if Melissa was already in the kitchen, planning her next move. I wondered if Alan would notice I was gone before she did. I reached into my handbag and withdrew the bank statement, the numbers reassuring in their quiet strength. George's voice echoed in my mind, strong, steady. "It's not about trust, it's about protection." I leaned back against the seat, closing my eyes. I could almost feel him beside me, his hand warm and solid over mine, his voice calm as the sea he'd loved so much. "Thank you, George," I whispered, "for teaching me how to stand on my own." The miles slipped by, the landscape changing from suburban sprawl to rolling fields, then to the rugged coastline that had always called to me. As the car rounded the final bend, the lighthouse came into view, its white tower rising proudly against the gray sky. My heart lifted. Here, I could breathe again. Here, I could be Helen Parker. Not the burden they'd tried to make me, but the woman George had always believed me to be. The driver pulled up to the small inn I'd reserved, a modest place with flower boxes in the windows and the scent of salt in the air. I paid the fare, adding a generous tip, and stepped out with my suitcase. As I stood on the sidewalk, I realized that the secret I'd kept for decades wasn't just about money. It was about resilience, about believing in myself when others doubted. It was about choosing my own path, even when others tried to pave it for me. I squared my shoulders and took a deep breath. The time for secrets was over. Now, it was time to live the life I'd built, one step at a time, on my own terms. Because sometimes the strongest foundation is the one you build in secret, stone by stone, day by day, until it's strong enough to carry you wherever you need to go. The inn smelled of old wood and salt air, a comforting scent that wrapped around me like a familiar blanket. I'd barely settled into my small, sunlit room, its window offering a view of the lighthouse and the restless sea, when the knock came at the door. 3 firm raps, confident and precise, like a gavel on a courtroom bench. I knew who it was before I opened it. Mr. Greenfield stood there in his perfectly tailored suit, the crisp white shirt unwrinkled despite the long drive from the city. His hair, more silver than brown now, was neatly combed, and his sharp blue eyes missed nothing. He'd been George's lawyer for decades, loyal, discreet, and shrewd. He'd helped us build our fortune, had witnessed the birth of the trust, and had guided me through the labyrinth of paperwork after George's death. "Helen," he said, his voice warm but edged with that quiet authority he'd always carried. "May I come in?" I stepped aside, gesturing toward the small table by the window. "Of course, Mr. Greenfield. Please have a seat." He set down his briefcase with the same care he'd always used, never rushed, never careless. He settled into the chair and folded his hands, looking at me like a father might look at a daughter he was both proud of and worried about. "I heard from Catherine," he said, and I felt a flicker of gratitude for the one member of my family who still seemed to care. "She was concerned. She said you'd left Alan's house in the early hours." I folded my hands in my lap, my eyes steady on his. "I had to leave," I said, my voice calm. "I couldn't stay there any longer." He nodded slowly, as if he'd expected nothing less. I understand, he said. I've been your attorney for a long time, Helen. I've seen you face challenges with grace and wisdom. But I have to ask, do you feel safe? The question hung in the air, heavy as a stone. I thought of Melissa's cold smile, of Alan's silence, of the whispered conversations that always seemed to end with me on the outside looking in. I feel safer now than I have in years, I said, my voice steady. I have the means to live on my own terms. George made sure of that, and so did I. His lips curved into a small smile, pride evident in the lines around his eyes. That's good to hear, he said. You've always been resourceful. He reached into his briefcase and withdrew a folder, placing it carefully on the table between us. This is everything we discussed, he said. The account statements, the property deeds, the revised trust documents. I've updated everything to reflect your current intentions. I opened the folder, scanning the neat columns of numbers, the signatures, the legal jargon that had once intimidated me, but now felt like second nature. I also included a letter I drafted on your behalf, he continued, his tone measured. For Alan. It explains your decision to leave, your plans for the trust, and your unwavering love for him, despite everything. A lump formed in my throat. Thank you, I whispered. He leaned back in his chair, studying me with those sharp blue eyes. Helen, I've known you for a long time. I've seen you navigate challenges most people would have crumbled under. But I have to ask, are you sure this is the path you want to take? I met his gaze squarely. I've never been more certain, I said. I gave them every chance. I waited for them to treat me like family. But they saw me as a burden, as an obstacle. And now they'll see the woman who built the foundation they stand on. His eyes gleamed with respect. Then I'll make the necessary arrangements, he said. The trust will remain in your control. The house and the investments are secure. Alan and Melissa can't touch them without your consent. I felt a weight lift from my chest, the chains of obligation falling away. Thank you, Mr. Greenfield, I said, for everything. He closed the folder and returned it to his briefcase. One more thing, he said, his tone softening. I've also drafted documents for Catherine, should you wish to include her in your plans. I know you've always had a special bond with her. A warmth spread through me at the mention of her name. Yes, I said, my voice gentle. She's different from the rest. She sees me. He nodded. I'll leave the documents with you. You can decide in your own time. He stood, gathering his briefcase, and paused at the door. Helen, he said, his voice filled with quiet admiration. I've always believed in you, and I think George would be proud. Tears pricked at the corners of my eyes, but I refused to let them fall. Thank you, I whispered. As he left, the room felt lighter, as if the sea breeze had blown away the last remnants of doubt. I turned back to the window, the lighthouse casting its steady beam across the darkening water. The visit from Mr. Greenfield had sealed it. I wasn't the woman they thought they could dismiss, the guest they could usher out with polite indifference. I was the matriarch, the architect of my own destiny, and the keeper of the secret that had sustained me all these years. Now it was time to wield that secret like a torch, to light the path to a future where I would never again be treated like a burden. The evening air carried the scent of salt and wood smoke as I sat at the small desk in my room at the inn. The documents Mr. Greenfield had left spread out before me like a map of my past and my future. The folder was thick with carefully drafted papers, each one a testament to the years I'd spent quietly building my own safety net, while others assumed I was content to fade into the background. The lighthouse beam swept across the water outside my window, casting a rhythmic glow that reminded me of George. Steady, reliable, always there when I needed him. I could almost hear his voice now, calm and reassuring. "Helen," he'd once said, "don't leave anything to chance. Plan for every possibility." That night, I took his advice to heart. I started with the trust. Mr. Greenfield had updated it to reflect my intentions, placing all assets, including the investments I'd grown and the house in my name, firmly under my control. Alan and Melissa wouldn't see a penny unless I allowed it. The thought brought a small, hard smile to my lips. They'd built their castle on what they thought was a foundation of unearned entitlement, but I'd just removed the keystone. Next, I reviewed the letter Mr. Greenfield had drafted for Alan. I read each word carefully, imagining his face as he took in the truth. That the mother he'd dismissed as a burden was the very reason he had the life he enjoyed. I signed the letter with a steady hand, sealing it in an envelope addressed to the house I'd left behind. But there was one more letter to write, one that no lawyer could draft for me. I pulled out a fresh sheet of paper and began writing to Catherine. "Dearest Catherine," I began, my pen moving swiftly. "I want you to know that none of this was ever about leaving you. You've always been a light in my life, a reminder of the goodness still left in our family. I see so much of George in you, in your honesty, your curiosity, your quiet strength. Never let anyone dim that light." I paused, the pen hovering over the page as I considered my next words. I wanted her to understand why I had to leave, that it wasn't an act of spite, but of self-respect. "I'm leaving because I deserve more than to be treated like an inconvenience," I continued. "I deserve to live out the rest of my days with dignity, on my own terms. I hope someday you'll understand, and maybe even be proud of me." I sealed the letter and placed it beside the one for Alan, a promise that she would always know the truth, even if the rest of them refused to see it. The documents done, I turned to the small suitcase on the bed. I packed carefully, folding each item with the precision of a woman who had spent a lifetime caring for others, making sure everything was just so. But this time, I was caring for myself. A soft knock on the door startled me. I opened it to find the innkeeper, a kind woman named Ruth, holding a cup of tea. "Just thought you might want a little comfort before bed," she said, her smile warm and genuine. "Thank you," I said, accepting the cup with a grateful nod. She hesitated at the threshold. "You seem like you've had a long journey," she said gently. I met her eyes, the weight of my years settling in my chest. "I have," I said, "but I'm finally going where I belong." She nodded, understanding in her eyes. "Then I wish you peace on your journey." I closed the door and sat back down at the desk, the tea warm in my hands. It was a small thing, but it reminded me that kindness still existed in the world, something I hadn't felt in that house in a long time. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the window pane. I imagined Melissa in her kitchen, planning tomorrow's errands, oblivious to the fact that the woman she'd tried to erase had slipped through her fingers like sand. Alan would find the letter soon enough, and with it, the realization that the foundation he'd taken for granted had shifted beneath his feet. I set the tea aside and picked up the folder, tucking it neatly into my suitcase. Everything was in order. Every document signed, every account secured, every secret laid bare. Tomorrow, I would close this chapter of my life for good. I would drive away from the expectations and manipulations that had weighed me down. I would reclaim my dignity, my freedom, and the power that had always been mine, but that I'd too long allowed others to wield for me. As I turned out the light, I felt a calm resolve settle over me like a comforting blanket. This wasn't just an escape. It was a carefully planned departure, a deliberate step into the life I deserved. Because sometimes, leaving isn't an act of weakness. It's the bravest choice of all. And as the lighthouse beam swept across the water one last time, I knew George would be proud. The morning dawned gray and solemn, a thick fog rolling in from the sea and wrapping the town in a damp hush. The lighthouse beam cut through the mist like a promise, a reminder that even on the darkest mornings, guidance was possible. I sat on the edge of the bed, suitcase closed at my feet, and let the quiet seep into my bones. I'd spent years living in someone else's house, walking on eggshells, letting polite smiles mask 100 small betrayals. But here, in this small coastal inn, with the smell of salt and sea and freedom, I felt more like myself than I had in decades. I dressed with care, a navy sweater, simple slacks, and the small gold locket George had given me on our 25th wedding anniversary. Inside, a faded photo of us smiling at the beach, arms wrapped around each other, faces sun-kissed and carefree. I touched the locket gently. "Thank you, George," I whispered, "for teaching me to stand on my own." My phone buzzed on the nightstand, an unwelcome interruption. I picked it up, the screen flashing Alan's name. My heart ached at the sight, but I silenced the call. I wasn't ready to hear his apologies, if they came at all. Not today. The letters I'd written to Alan and Catherine lay on the desk, waiting for the post. I'd thought about delivering them in person, but some truths are best read in private, with no one watching the tears that might come. I left them on the polished wood, weighed down by a small vase of fresh flowers Ruth had brought in last night. A simple reminder that kindness could still bloom in the most unexpected places. Outside, the fog began to lift, revealing the town waking up to another ordinary day. But for me, nothing about this day was ordinary. This was the day I would reclaim everything that had been quietly stolen from me. My dignity, my freedom, and the respect I'd been denied for too long. A soft knock came at the door, and Ruth's warm face peeked through the crack. "Car's waiting for you, Helen," she said, her voice gentle. "Are you sure you're ready?" I smiled, the weight of my decision finally feeling light. "I've been ready for a long time," I said. She stepped inside, pressing a small paper bag into my hand. "Just a little something for the road," she said. "A sandwich, some fruit. I couldn't let you leave on an empty stomach." Tears pricked at my eyes as I took the bag. "Thank you, Ruth. For everything." She nodded, understanding more than she could ever know. "Safe travels, Helen." I picked up my suitcase and walked down the narrow hallway, my steps steady. Each one felt like shedding another layer of a life that had grown too tight, too small for the woman I had become. The car was waiting at the curb, a modest sedan with a driver who looked at me with polite indifference, a blank slate onto which I could project my own story. I loaded my suitcase into the trunk and settled into the back seat, the leather cool against my skin. As we pulled away, I turned for one last look at the inn, its windows glowing with the soft light of early morning. I'd arrived here a woman broken by betrayal, but I was leaving as someone who had found her voice again. The car rolled through the town, past the bakery where George and I had once shared cinnamon rolls, past the park where we'd sat on a bench and planned the future. Every memory was a thread in the tapestry of my life, but none of them defined me anymore. I was not just a wife, or a mother, or a grandmother. I was Helen Parker, the woman who had the foresight to build her own foundation when no one else thought she could. As we reached the edge of town, the driver glanced at me in the rearview mirror. "Where to, ma'am?" he asked. I smiled, my voice strong and clear. "To the bank first," I said, thinking of the account that had quietly grown like a seed in the dark, waiting for this very day. "And then to the cottage by the sea." He nodded, and the car merged onto the highway, the road stretching ahead like a promise. The fog had lifted completely now, the sun breaking through the clouds and painting the water in shades of gold and silver. It felt like an omen, a sign that I'd chosen the right path. I leaned back, letting the hum of the tires on asphalt lull me into a quiet peace. This was my escape, but it was also my return to the woman I'd always been beneath the layers of expectation and duty. Today wasn't just the morning of my escape. It was the morning I stepped into my own life, fully and completely. The sun had reached its zenith by the time I arrived at the cottage by the sea, a modest, whitewashed structure with blue shutters that matched the water's hue. I'd bought it quietly years ago, the deed filed under my maiden name, tucked away from curious eyes and idle speculation. A small act of rebellion, a silent promise to myself that I'd always have somewhere to land if the ground gave way beneath my feet. The driver carried my suitcase to the porch, his polite smile revealing nothing of the life he might imagine for me. I thanked him and watched as the car rolled away, leaving only the sound of waves lapping at the shore and the cries of gulls overhead. I stood for a moment, breathing in the scent of salt and seaweed, letting the wind lift my hair like a benediction. Then I turned and stepped inside, the screen door creaking on its hinges like an old friend. The kitchen was the first room I entered. The light streamed in through the lace curtains, casting patterns on the worn wooden floor. The counters were clean, the stove gleamed, and the sink shone like a beacon of quiet readiness. But the air was still, expectant, like a stage waiting for its actors. I set my handbag on the table and ran my fingers across the smooth surface. Memories rose like ghosts. This was the kitchen where George and I had made plans over steaming mugs of coffee, where I'd taught Catherine to roll cookie dough into perfect spheres on a rainy afternoon, where I'd once stood alone, wondering who I was outside of wife, mother, grandmother. The room had always held a certain magic, a place where nourishment met conversation, where laughter echoed against the walls even on the grayest days. But now it was empty, stripped of voices and footsteps, and all the small sounds that make a house a home. I opened the cupboards, finding them neatly organized with simple dishes and the same blue-rimmed mugs I'd chosen long ago. They were a reminder that I'd prepared for this, even when I hadn't realized it. I'd bought the cottage as an escape hatch, but I'd stocked the kitchen as a home. A small smile tugged at my lips as I imagined Melissa in her gleaming suburban kitchen, every appliance arranged like a soldier in parade rest. She'd always believed that a kitchen was just another battlefield, a place to assert her control. But here, in this quiet sanctuary, the kitchen felt like a refuge, a place where I could breathe without waiting for the next demand or disapproving glance. I filled the kettle and set it on the stove, the whistle promising warmth and comfort. As the water heated, I moved through the kitchen, opening drawers, reacquainting myself with the rhythm of this place. The salt shaker with its tiny chip, the old wooden spoon that had belonged to my grandmother, the small collection of recipe cards, their edges soft from years of use. When the kettle shrieked, I poured the water into a chipped blue teapot and added a spoonful of loose-leaf tea. The scent rose, fragrant and familiar, reminding me of quiet mornings with George when the world was still asleep. I carried the teapot to the table and sat down, the steam curling like a question mark in the air. I thought of Alan and his silence, of Melissa and her controlling smile, of Catherine's hopeful eyes. I wondered if they'd found my letter by now, if they were reading my words and realizing that the foundation they'd taken for granted had shifted beneath their feet. I'd written the letter carefully, choosing each word like a stone in a path I was laying for them. I'd told Alan that I loved him, that I'd always love him, but that love couldn't survive in the shadow of manipulation and silence. I'd told him that I'd taken what was mine, not out of spite, but out of necessity. And Catherine. Sweet, curious Catherine. I'd told her that she was the best of them, that she had the strength to rise above the pettiness and entitlement that had infected our family. I hoped she'd read those words and see the woman I truly was. Not the burden they'd made me out to be, but the matriarch who had built and protected and loved, even when it was hard. The tea cooled in my cup as I watched the seagulls wheel over the water, their cries echoing across the empty kitchen. A knock at the door startled me, a quick rap that sent my heart leaping. For a moment, I wondered if Alan had followed me, if he'd come to plead for understanding or to beg forgiveness. But when I opened the door, it was Ruth, the innkeeper, holding a small package in her hands. "Left at the front desk for you," she said, her eyes kind. "From Mr. Greenfield, I believe." I took the package and nodded my thanks. Inside, wrapped in brown paper, was the final piece of the puzzle. The keys to the house, the finalized trust documents, the last signatures that made my departure complete. I set the package on the table and closed the door behind me, the quiet of the empty kitchen wrapping around me like a promise. This was my sanctuary now, my space to heal, to grow, to remember the woman I'd been before the world tried to shrink me. I sat in the empty kitchen long after the sun had set, the only light coming from a small lamp on the table beside the teapot. The package from Mr. Greenfield sat open before me, papers neatly stacked, keys to the house on top, the trust documents in their final signed form. The weight of my decisions pressed on my shoulders, but it wasn't a burden. It was a liberation I'd waited a lifetime to claim. The sea air drifted in through the cracked window, carrying with it the tang of salt and the distant crash of waves against the shore. It felt like the world itself was holding its breath, waiting to see what I'd do next. My thoughts drifted to the house I'd left behind, the one where Alan and Melissa would be finding my letters, the ones I'd written with trembling hands and a steady heart. I imagined the scene unfolding even now. Melissa's sharp intake of breath, Alan's guilty silence, Catherine's wide, searching eyes. They'd thought they knew me. They'd thought I was a relic, an afterthought, a burden to be managed and maneuvered. But the letters I'd left behind would shatter that illusion, laying bare the woman I truly was. Strong, self-sufficient, and unafraid to reclaim what was always mine. I remembered the moment I'd sealed the envelope to Alan. I'd chosen my words carefully, each one a measured step on a path I'd paved myself. "Alan," I'd written, "I hope you'll read these words with the same love I've always felt for you. I know you think you were protecting me by staying silent, by letting Melissa make the decisions, but silence can be more harmful than any words. I raised you to be strong, to stand for what's right. I hope someday you'll find that strength again." I'd paused, imagining his face as he read those lines, his brow furrowed, his lips pressed into a thin line, the weight of his choices settling on his shoulders. I hoped he would finally see the truth, that my leaving wasn't about punishing him. It was about saving myself. To Melissa, I'd written less, but the words carried a sharper edge. "Melissa," I'd begun, "I hope this letter finds you in a moment of reflection. You've always been determined, always certain you know what's best. But control is not the same as love. Power is not the same as respect. I wish you peace, but I won't allow you to dictate the terms of my life any longer." I'd folded that letter slowly, my hands steady. I doubted she'd understand. Melissa had always been more interested in appearances than in understanding the people around her. But at least she'd know that I saw her clearly, and that I'd chosen to leave on my own terms. But it was Catherine's letter that had taken the longest to write. "Dearest Catherine," I'd written, the pen trembling in my hand. "You have always been my light in that house. You saw me when no one else did, and I want you to know that you are stronger than you realize. Don't let the bitterness around you harden your heart. Be the woman your father and I always knew you could be. Curious, kind, and courageous. I'd added one final line, my heart aching as I wrote it. And remember, I will always be proud of you. A tear had slipped down my cheek then, but I hadn't let it fall on the paper. I'd wiped it away and folded the letter, sealing it with the quiet certainty of a promise kept. Now, in the solitude of my new kitchen, I felt the echo of those words like a song in the air. The letters were my legacy to them, my last gift before I stepped into the life I'd crafted for myself. I rose and carried the teapot to the sink, rinsing it with the steady hand of a woman who'd spent her life caring for others, but who had finally learned to care for herself. I dried it carefully and set it back on the shelf, its place in this kitchen secure. As I moved through the cottage, I felt the stillness settle around me like a balm. This place was mine, every inch of it. No whispered judgments, no dismissive glances, no polite betrayals. Just the quiet certainty that I'd chosen this path because it was mine to choose. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the window panes and sending a shiver down my spine. But it wasn't fear I felt. It was anticipation. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, perhaps even regrets. But tonight, in this moment, I was at peace. Because sometimes a letter left behind is more than just words on a page. It's a declaration. A declaration that says, I see you, I understand you, and I refuse to be defined by your expectations. I sat back down at the table, the scent of salt and old wood filling the room. The lighthouse beam swept across the water, steady and unwavering, just like the woman I'd become. And in the quiet, I smiled. Morning arrived with a cautious glow, painting the horizon in shades of pink and gray. The fog had rolled out to sea, leaving the cottage bathed in a clean, sharp light. I stood at the window with a cup of tea, the lighthouse's beam now silent, its nightly vigil complete. Today, its watch had ended, and mine had begun. The letters I'd left behind felt like anchors finally lifted. I'd spent decades tethered to a house that had become more prison than home, a place where I'd been reduced to the role of caretaker, bank account, burden. But in the cottage, with its creaking floors and sunlit rooms, I'd found something I hadn't known I'd lost. Myself. The small duffel bag sat by the door, its contents modest but meaningful. A change of clothes, a worn leather journal that held notes from years of planning, and the final updated trust documents. Everything I needed to begin anew. The old gold locket hung around my neck, a silent witness to the woman I'd been, and the woman I'd become. Ruth had slipped a small envelope under my door before sunrise. Inside was a note written in her careful script. Helen, I wish you peace and strength on your journey. You deserve every bit of it. Ruth. A single tear had slipped down my cheek as I read it, but it wasn't a tear of sorrow. It was relief, gratitude, the kind of tear that marked the end of one life and the beginning of another. I slipped into the driver's seat of the small sedan I'd bought through Mr. Greenfield's assistance. It was a sensible car, unremarkable, the kind of vehicle that would carry me quietly through town and onto the open road. No one would suspect it of carrying a woman with secrets, with a lifetime of strength finally unfurled. I adjusted the mirrors, the lighthouse receding in the distance, its silhouette etched against the morning sky. A reminder of the steady hand George had given me, the lessons in foresight and caution, the gentle nudges toward independence even when I didn't recognize them. The road unspooled ahead like a promise, each mile a step further from the life I'd left behind. I passed the small shops and cafes where I'd once sat with George on our anniversary trips, sharing laughter and plans for a future that had ended too soon. I let those memories settle like warm sand, reminders of a love that had made me stronger, not weaker. The highway opened up beyond the town, the sea to my left, the fields rolling to my right. I rolled down the window, letting the salt air whip through my hair, letting it tangle and dance as if it were reclaiming its own freedom. At the first rest stop, I pulled over and cut the engine. The quiet settled around me, thick and comforting. I reached for the locket around my neck, running my thumb over the smooth gold. I'd worn it every day since George had given it to me, its weight a reminder of the promise he'd made, and the promise I'd kept to myself. Inside was a faded photograph of us, our heads pressed together, eyes bright with hope. Beneath it, carefully hidden, was the small key to the safe deposit box that held the final pieces of my independence, the backup accounts, the titles, the last investments I'd nurtured on my own. George had taught me to build bridges, but he'd also taught me to keep doors open that no one else knew about. I held the key in my palm, the metal cool and reassuring. Melissa would be raging by now, her carefully constructed plans crumbling in the face of my departure. Alan would be silent, weighing his next steps in a house that no longer felt like home. And Catherine, dear Catherine, would be reading my letter, understanding that my leaving wasn't an abandonment, but a declaration of my own worth. I closed my hand around the key, a quiet promise to myself that I'd never again let someone else define my place in the world. Starting the engine, I pulled back onto the road, the horizon stretching wide and unbroken. The lighthouse faded from view in the rearview mirror, replaced by open sky and the infinite possibilities of a life lived on my own terms. For too long, I'd been the woman who stood behind others, supporting them, making sure their dreams came true. But this was my drive now, my journey. I would decide where it led and how it ended. As the miles rolled away beneath my tires, I felt the last remnants of that house. Melissa's sharp voice, Alan's quiet compliance, dissolve like morning mist. In their place rose something stronger: resolve, purpose, and the freedom to be the woman George always believed I could be. Sometimes, freedom isn't found in the grand gestures, but in the quiet, steady miles between the past and the future. And with every mile, I was closer to the woman I'd always meant to become. I arrived in the city by noon, the sun a pale disk behind a sky of shifting clouds. The streets bustled with the quiet hum of a weekday afternoon. Shopkeepers arranging displays, business people hurrying past with their heads down, the occasional tourist marveling at the architecture. Amid the rush, I felt strangely untethered, like a leaf drifting on the current, free but uncertain where I might land. Mr. Greenfield's office was in one of those elegant old buildings with marble steps, worn smooth by decades of footsteps. I paused at the bottom, hand on the rail, and thought of all the times I'd climbed these stairs in the company of George, always steady, always with purpose. Today, I climbed alone, each step a testament to my independence. The receptionist, a young woman with kind eyes, greeted me with a warm smile. "Mrs. Parker, Mr. Greenfield is expecting you. Please, go right in." I nodded my thanks and crossed the threshold into the familiar office. Mr. Greenfield rose from behind his mahogany desk, his tailored suit as immaculate as always. His eyes, sharp and kind all at once, rested on me with the gravity of someone who'd spent a lifetime untangling other people's messes. "Helen," he said, extending his hand. "Come in. Sit down." I settled into the chair across from him, the leather cool against my back. He closed the door, ensuring privacy. The air felt thick with anticipation, like a storm about to break. "First," he began, folding his hands on the desk, "let me say how proud I am of you. Few people have the strength to do what you've done." A smile tugged at my lips, but it felt fragile, like it might shatter with the wrong word. "Thank you," I murmured. He leaned back, his expression thoughtful. "I reviewed the trust documents this morning," he said, sliding a thick folder toward me. "Everything is in order. The assets are secure, the house is in your name alone, and the separate accounts are fully funded." I reached for the folder, feeling the weight of it in my hands. Decades of planning and patience condensed into a few dozen sheets of paper. "There's something else," he continued, his voice lower now. He opened a small drawer in his desk and withdrew a single envelope, its edges worn, the paper yellowed with age. "George left this with me just after he set up the trust. He told me to give it to you only when I felt you were ready." My breath caught. "Ready?" I echoed, my heart pounding. Mr. Greenfield nodded gravely. "He said you'd know when that time had come." With trembling hands, I opened the envelope. Inside was a letter in George's familiar looping script. The sight of it made my eyes sting, but I blinked away the tears. "My dearest Helen," it began. "If you're reading this, it means you found the strength I always knew you had. I never doubted that you would. I'm sorry I couldn't be there to tell you this in person, but there are things I need you to know. Things I couldn't say then without complicating everything we'd built." I read on, each word a lifeline, each sentence a reminder of the man I'd loved and the secrets he'd kept to protect me. "I left you more than the trust," the letter continued. "I built something else, something only you can decide to reveal. You know the accounts I taught you to manage, the investments we nurtured together. But there's another account, one in your name alone, hidden from prying eyes. A final gift, if you will, for the day you decided to choose yourself." My hands trembled as I read. Mr. Greenfield watched me with that same calm, measured gaze, giving me space to absorb the revelation. "It's in the safe deposit box," George's letter concluded. "Use it however you see fit. For yourself, for Catherine, for the legacy you choose to leave behind. I trust your judgment more than anyone else's." I lowered the letter, my heart hammering in my chest. "He always planned for this," I whispered. "Even then, he knew I'd need a way out." Mr. Greenfield nodded. "George was a visionary, Helen. But more than that, he loved you enough to make sure you'd never be cornered by anyone or anything." A wave of gratitude washed over me, mixed with a fierce resolve. The safe deposit box held more than money. It held freedom, options, a tangible reminder that I had always been more than the burden they tried to make me believe I was. "I want to see it," I said, my voice steady. Mr. Greenfield's eyes gleamed with approval. "I thought you might. I've already arranged the appointment at the bank." I stood, my spine straight, the weight of the letter a quiet strength in my hands. "Then let's finish this." Because sometimes a lawyer's revelation isn't just about money or property. Sometimes it's the final key to unlocking a life you'd been too afraid to claim. And today, I was done being afraid. The bank was a short drive from Mr. Greenfield's office, nestled on a quiet street where the trees still held their late autumn leaves, gold and red like a painter's palette. I sat in the passenger seat while Mr. Greenfield drove, his steady hands at the wheel, his eyes watchful, yet unintrusive. "You've always been one of my most remarkable clients, Helen," he said, his voice carrying the warmth of shared history. "George was right to trust you." I smiled faintly, my fingers brushing the letter George had left for me, now folded neatly in my purse. "He taught me well," I replied, my voice soft but resolute. At the bank, we were escorted to a small private room by a polite young woman in a navy suit who couldn't have been more than 25. She unlocked the safe deposit box with a practiced hand and left us alone, the heavy door shutting with a quiet finality. Mr. Greenfield motioned for me to proceed, his expression encouraging. I turned the small brass key in the lock, my hands steady. The box slid open with a soft hiss, revealing its contents. Inside was a folder thick with documents, a small velvet pouch, and a single brass key that gleamed in the dim light. My breath caught at the sight of the key, my heart stuttering like a bird's wings. I reached for the folder first, my fingers brushing the worn edges. Inside were deeds, purchase agreements, and tax records, all in my name alone. Mr. Greenfield leaned forward slightly, his eyes sharp. "He always wanted you to have a place that was truly yours," he said. "No strings attached, no conditions." Tears blurred my vision as I flipped through the pages. The house was in a quiet neighborhood in the city. Brick, 2 stories, a small garden in the back. I recognized it immediately from the time George and I had walked that street, hand in hand, on one of our rare afternoons alone. I'd admired the house then, its sturdy lines and welcoming porch, the way it seemed to stand with quiet dignity among its neighbors. "I remember telling him I loved that house," I whispered, the memory as vivid as yesterday. "I said it looked like a place where someone could truly belong." Mr. Greenfield's smile was gentle, tinged with sadness. He remembered. He bought it the following week, put it in your name but never told you. He wanted you to find it when you were ready. I let out a shaky breath, the reality of it hitting me like a wave. All these years, that house had been waiting, a sanctuary hidden in plain sight. Next, I opened the velvet pouch. Inside, nestled against the soft fabric, was a simple gold band, a ring. I held it up to the light, the engraving catching my eye. "To H, so you always have a home," it read. My throat tightened. George had thought of everything. Even in death, he'd left me a promise that I would never be alone. I slipped the ring onto my finger, its weight grounding me, a quiet reminder that I wasn't starting over. I was continuing a legacy built on love, trust, and foresight. Mr. Greenfield cleared his throat softly. "The house is ready whenever you are," he said. "There's no rush, but I've arranged for the utilities to be in your name. A small staff has kept it clean all these years, just waiting for you." I closed the folder, my hand firm on its cover. "I'm ready now," I said. We left the bank together, the documents carefully secured in my bag. The sky had darkened slightly, the clouds gathering like a promise of rain. But the air felt different, filled with possibility rather than dread. Mr. Greenfield offered to drive me to the house, but I shook my head. "This is something I need to do alone," I said. He understood. He always did. I climbed into my own car, the brass key warm in my hand, and pulled away from the bank. The city blurred past, each streetlight a waypoint in the journey I'd chosen for myself. When I reached the house, I parked at the curb and sat for a moment, taking it in. The brick walls glowed softly in the late afternoon light, the garden neat and welcoming. It looked just as I'd remembered it, solid, dependable, waiting. I stepped out of the car, my shoes crunching on the fallen leaves. The key turned smoothly in the lock, the door swinging open on silent hinges. Inside, the air smelled faintly of lavender and wood polish. The rooms were empty, but they didn't feel abandoned. They felt like a blank canvas, like an invitation. I stood in the entryway, the brass key still in my hand, and let the sense of belonging wash over me. This was my house, bought in my name, a home waiting to be filled with laughter, memories, and the quiet satisfaction of a life reclaimed. Because sometimes, the greatest gift isn't just the place you go. It's knowing that you've chosen it for yourself. Right there in that moment, I knew that I was home. The house settled around me that first night, a quiet that felt like a blessing rather than an absence. I moved from room to room, touching the walls, opening the windows to let the cool evening breeze wash away any lingering ghosts. This was mine, and I would make it my own in every way. By morning, I felt something shift inside me. The uncertainty had faded, replaced by a calm determination. I made tea in the small kitchen, the same way I'd done in the cottage by the sea, and watched the sun rise over the garden. Each ray of light was a promise, each sip a reminder that I was building something new. But my thoughts kept drifting back to the house I'd left behind. Alan, Melissa, and Catherine, and the letters I'd written to them. I wondered how they'd reacted to the truth, to the quiet strength of the words I'd finally spoken out loud. It didn't take long for the answer to arrive. Late that afternoon, as I was arranging a vase of fresh flowers on the table in the front hall, there was a knock at the door, sharp, insistent. I set the flowers down and wiped my hands on my apron, my heart steady in my chest. I opened the door to find Alan standing there, his face drawn and pale, his shoulders slumped beneath the weight of something he hadn't expected to carry. "Mother," he said, his voice rough. "May I come in?" I stepped aside, wordless, and watched as he crossed the threshold into the house that was mine, every inch of it a testament to choices he'd never even known I'd made. Alan looked around, taking in the warm wood floors, the simple furniture, the quiet dignity of the place. "I didn't know," he said finally, his voice small. "About this, about any of it." I closed the door behind him, the soft click echoing like a final punctuation mark. "No," I said, my voice gentle but firm. "You didn't know because you didn't ask. You let Melissa tell you who I was, and you chose to believe her." He winced, the truth of it settling heavy on his shoulders. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I should have seen it sooner." I said nothing, because sometimes there was nothing to say. Before the silence could grow too heavy, the doorbell rang again, a bright chime that cut through the tension like a blade. I opened the door to find Catherine standing there, her dark hair pulled back, her eyes bright with something I recognized: curiosity, determination, hope. "Grandma," she said, her voice clear. "I wanted to see you, to see this." I stepped back to let her in, my heart swelling with quiet pride. She took in the house with an appraising gaze, her fingers brushing the smooth banister, the worn edge of the table. "It's beautiful," she said softly. "It feels right." I smiled, a small thing but genuine. "It's mine," I said. "Every part of it." Catherine nodded, understanding more than Alan ever could. She turned to him, her expression gentle but resolute. "Dad, you need to see what she's built. You need to understand what she's done, not just for herself, but for all of us." Alan swallowed hard, his hands clenching and unclenching at his sides. "I don't know how to fix it," he admitted, his voice cracking. "I don't know how to make up for all the years I let you believe I didn't care." I reached out and took his hand, the warmth of it familiar and foreign all at once. "I don't need you to fix it, Alan," I said quietly. "I just need you to see me. Truly see me. Not as a burden, not as a responsibility, but as your mother. As the woman who raised you to be better than this." Tears filled his eyes, but he blinked them back, nodding once. "I'm trying," he whispered. Before I could respond, the doorbell rang again, and this time it was Melissa who stood on the porch, her lips tight, her eyes wary. She stepped inside without waiting for an invitation, her gaze sweeping the room like a hawk's. "So this is where you've been hiding," she said, her voice clipped. I met her gaze without flinching. "Not hiding," I said. "Living. There's a difference." Melissa looked at Alan, her jaw clenched. Are you really going to stand here and pretend this changes everything? Alan turned to her, his shoulders straightening for the first time in years. It does change everything, he said quietly, because she was never the one in the wrong. The silence that followed was deep, a chasm filled with unspoken truths. Melissa's face hardened, but Catherine stepped forward, placing a hand on my arm. I don't know how we move forward from here, she said softly, but I want to try. I want to understand. I looked at her, this granddaughter who had always seen me, always known there was more beneath the surface, and I nodded. Then come in, I said, stepping back to let them all truly see the home I'd built. Let's sit, let's talk. Because sometimes, a family meeting with unexpected guests is the first step toward rebuilding what was broken, if only they're willing to see the truth. The living room was awash in the soft glow of late afternoon light, filtering through the gauzy curtains and catching the motes of dust that danced like tiny secrets in the air. Alan sat stiffly on the edge of the couch, his hands clasped in front of him, as if he were bracing for an impact that had already come. Catherine perched beside him, her eyes darting between us, a silent witness to a family unraveling and stitching itself back together all at once. Melissa stood by the window, arms crossed, her lips pressed into a thin line that threatened to disappear entirely. Her eyes, cold and calculating, met mine with a challenge that neither of us was willing to look away from. I stood in the center of the room, the weight of years of silence finally falling from my shoulders. I could feel the pulse of my own heart, strong and steady, reminding me that this was my house, my sanctuary, and that no one could take that from me now. Mother, Alan began, his voice trembling. I don't know how to say this, but I need to understand. Why didn't you tell us? Why did you let it get this far? I turned to him, my gaze soft but unwavering. Alan, I said gently, I tried. More times than you realize. But every time I opened my mouth, I was silenced. By your wife's dismissive tone, by your own reluctance to see what was right in front of you. I stayed quiet because I wanted to believe you'd come to your own conclusions. Because I thought you'd fight for me, just once. His face crumpled, guilt etching lines deeper than time ever could. Melissa scoffed, the sound sharp in the stillness. So this is my fault then? Because I was protecting our family? Because I wanted to make sure you didn't drain every last cent from us? I turned my full attention to her now, my voice low but firm. No, Melissa. It's your fault because you mistook kindness for weakness. You mistook patience for permission. And you mistook me for someone who would let you rewrite my story. She opened her mouth to reply, but no words came. Catherine reached for my hand, her grip warm and steady. Grandma, she said softly, what do you want now? I looked around the room, at the family I'd spent a lifetime supporting, loving, enduring, and I realized that what I wanted wasn't something they could give me. It was something I had already taken for myself. I want peace, I said simply, and I want respect. Alan stood before me, his shoulders slumped in defeat, his eyes red-rimmed from the tears he'd tried, and failed, to hold back. The living room, once filled with laughter and Sunday dinners, now felt like a courtroom, the silence between us thick with unspoken truths. Mom, he began, his voice hoarse. I'm sorry. I should have stood up for you. I should have listened. I regarded him quietly, the weight of years pressing down. How many times had I waited for this? How many times had I longed for him to see me not as an obligation, but as a mother worthy of love and respect? I know, I said, my voice steady but tinged with sadness. But you didn't. He flinched, as if my words had cut him. And maybe they had. Maybe that was the only way he'd understand the depth of the wound. "Melissa," he stammered, his gaze darting to his wife, who still stood with arms crossed, her expression an unreadable mask. She made it all sound so reasonable. She said you were a burden," I finished for him, my tone cool but unwavering. "An inconvenience. Something to be managed." He nodded miserably. I believed her. I let her talk me into thinking it was best for everyone. I never stopped to think about what was best for you. Tears pricked at the corners of my eyes, but I refused to let them fall. "That's the thing, Alan," I said quietly. "You didn't think. You just followed." The words hung in the air like smoke. Catherine sat in the corner, her hands folded tightly in her lap, her eyes shimmering with unspoken grief. She had always been the one who tried to bridge the gaps, to heal the fractures others pretended didn't exist. "I'm sorry," Alan said again, his voice breaking. "I'll make it right. I shook my head slowly, a small, sad smile on my lips. "It's too late for that," I said. "I don't need your permission or your protection anymore. I've found my own way." Because sometimes a son's apology comes too late to mend what's already been broken. And sometimes the strongest love is the one that lets go. The sun dipped low, casting the house in a soft golden light. Shadows stretched across the wooden floors like memories, and I let the quiet fill the space that had once been occupied by so many voices demanding my time, my patience, my forgiveness. Now, the only voice that mattered was my own. Alan and Melissa had left an hour earlier, their apologies and explanations trailing like smoke behind them. Catherine had lingered, her eyes filled with a mix of sorrow and hope, her hand warm in mine before she finally stepped out into the evening. And now, I was alone. But for the first time in a long time, that solitude didn't feel like abandonment. It felt like freedom. I walked through the house, touching the walls I'd claimed for myself. The house George had bought in my name. The house that held my secrets and my strength. Every corner, every worn floorboard, was a testament to the woman I'd become. In the kitchen, I poured a cup of tea and carried it to the small table by the window. I watched the last rays of sunlight glint off the brass key that had unlocked this new chapter of my life. The same key that had unlocked the final piece of independence I hadn't known I'd needed until now. The true value of independence, I realized, wasn't just about money or property, or even a name on a deed. It was about standing in a room alone and knowing that every choice I made was mine. It was about drinking tea in the fading light without waiting for anyone's approval. It was about the quiet certainty that I'd finally stepped out from beneath the shadows of others' expectations and into the light of my own worth. I thought of George then, his steady hand on mine, his patient voice urging me to be prepared. He had given me so many gifts over the years, but this one, the one I'd waited the longest to open, was the one I cherished most. Because sometimes, the greatest inheritance isn't money or property or even legacy. It's the strength to live life on your own terms. And in that moment, with the sunset painting the sky in hues of orange and rose, I knew that I was exactly where I needed to be. Independent, whole, and finally, free. The morning light streamed through the kitchen window, painting the worn wooden table in a soft, hopeful glow. I wrapped my hands around a warm cup of tea, savoring the quiet that had become my sanctuary. It was a different kind of silence now, not the heavy hush of a house where I'd once felt unwelcome, but a gentle, welcoming stillness that felt like possibility. I'd spent the past few days arranging the rooms just the way I liked them. The floral armchair that had once occupied a neglected corner now sat proudly by the fireplace, draped with the quilt George and I had picked out on a trip to Maine so many years ago. The kitchen shelves, once bare, now held simple dishes I'd chosen myself. No more matching sets purchased by Melissa, with an eye for appearances rather than comfort. Everywhere I looked, there were small touches of me. A worn recipe card from my mother's kitchen, a tiny ceramic vase Catherine had given me, a stack of books I'd been meaning to read for years. Little pieces of a life finally lived on my terms. I'd always thought independence would feel like a grand gesture, a new car, a fresh start in some distant place. But instead, it felt like small, deliberate choices. It was picking out a new mug for my tea, planting lavender in the garden, deciding to spend a quiet evening watching the sun set without needing to justify it to anyone. Sometimes, freedom was as simple as choosing to spend an afternoon in your own company and finding peace in it. A soft knock at the door pulled me from my reverie. I set down my tea and walked to the entryway, where Catherine stood holding a small basket of fresh-baked scones. Her face was bright with relief, her smile genuine. "Grandma," she said, her eyes glistening, "I couldn't let you settle in without a proper housewarming." My heart swelled at the sight of her. I pulled her into a hug, feeling her warmth chase away the last lingering shadows of doubt. "Thank you, darling," I said, my voice thick. "You're the first guest in my new home." She laughed, a sound that danced through the hallway like music. "Then let's make it special." And as we carried the basket to the kitchen, I realized that my new life wasn't just about being alone. It was about choosing who to invite in, and on what terms. Because sometimes the greatest freedom isn't found in solitude, but in the power to decide who deserves a seat at your table. Later that evening, Catherine and I sat in the living room, the fire crackling softly in the hearth. The scones she'd brought were long gone, replaced by mugs of tea and the warm, comforting silence that had settled between us. She watched the flames, her eyes thoughtful. "Grandma," she began, her voice gentle but tinged with curiosity. "How did you learn to be so strong? Even when they tried to break you down, you always found a way to stand tall." I smiled, the lines around my mouth deepening as I met her gaze. "Strength," I said slowly, "isn't something you're born with, Catherine. It's something you build, one choice at a time." She tilted her head, listening intently. "I learned it the hard way," I continued. "I learned it every time I stayed quiet when I should have spoken, every time I let someone else decide my worth, every time I walked away from a fight because it was easier than standing my ground." She frowned. "But you did stand your ground, Grandma. You left. You took back what was yours." I nodded. Yes, but only after I realized that my silence wasn't protecting anyone. It was just giving others the power to define me. And that's the lesson I want you to remember, Catherine. Never let someone else decide your worth. Never let their expectations become your truth. She leaned back, her expression thoughtful, and I saw her mother's eyes in her, bright, determined, a little wary. But unlike her mother, Catherine's eyes shone with a desire to understand rather than to control. "And what about them?" she asked after a pause. "Alan, Melissa, do you think they've learned anything?" I let out a long sigh, the weight of years slipping from my shoulders. "Maybe," I said. "Maybe Alan will find his voice. Maybe Melissa will realize that control isn't the same as respect. But whether they do or not, it's not my burden to carry anymore." She reached for my hand, her grip warm and sure. "You've taught me more than I can say, Grandma. About strength, about love, about choosing your own path." A lump formed in my throat as I squeezed her hand back. "And you've taught me," I whispered, "that even in the hardest moments, there's always hope. that the best lessons aren't the ones we read in books, but the ones we live, together. And in that fire-lit room, I felt the promise of a new generation, a promise I'd fought for, one choice at a time. As the embers in the fireplace faded to a warm glow, I felt a peace settle deep within me, a peace earned through every choice, every hard-won victory, every quiet act of defiance that had built the life I now claimed as my own. I'd spent a lifetime carrying others, children, spouses, expectations that were never mine to fulfill. But here, in the home I'd chosen for myself, I had finally laid down those burdens. I had stepped into a life defined not by what others wanted of me, but by who I had become. Independence wasn't just about having my own house or money in the bank. It was about owning my story, rewriting it in my own hand, and leaving behind the roles others had assigned me. I thought of Alan, Melissa, and Catherine, the family I'd nurtured and protected, sometimes at my own expense. They each had their own journeys to take, their own lessons to learn. Some lessons would come too late. Others, I hoped, would come just in time to set them free, just as I had finally freed myself. So to those who are listening now, let this story be a reminder. It's never too late to choose yourself. Never too late to rewrite your story, to find your voice, to step into the life you were meant to lead. Because sometimes the strongest act of love is the one that starts with loving yourself. If you found this story meaningful, don't forget to subscribe and join me for more tales of resilience, courage, and the quiet power that comes from within. Until next time, take care, and never forget that the life you want is always within reach.